Everyone, we're live.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight as part of the American Conversation series. This is our latest installment. It's called the ISMs, the facts and myths about socialism, capitalism, and populism. And we've gathered a great moderator and panel for you. And on behalf, therefore, of Mary Hendricks, the president of Shepherd University, and our entire Shepherd University community, our faculty and our staff, thank you so much for taking an interest in our topic tonight. And we are so grateful that you have joined us, and we hope to and expect to have a wonderful evening. Let me introduce our panel, and I will then disappear into the background and enjoy with you the discussion that will ensue. Paul Solman, our moderator, is a journalist who has specialized in economics for several decades, reporting on PBS. He's been the business and economics correspondent for the PBS NewsHour since 1985, with occasional forays into other endeavors as well. Paul is the recipient of, believe it or not, 8 Emmys and 3 Peabody Awards. Yascha Mount is a German-American political scientist. He is currently an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. Mr. Mount has emerged as one of the world's leading thinkers on such movements as nationalism and populism. In 2020, he founded Persuasion, an online magazine devoted to defending the values of free societies. Dr. Art Holstag is a professor of political science at our own Shepherd University. He previously taught at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. His specialization is in international relations, specifically international organization, international law, and human rights. His research focuses around the role of the individual in global politics. And Dr. Gary Wolfram is the William E. Simon Professor in Economics and Public Policy at Hillsdale College and president of the Hillsdale Policy Group. Wolfram's public policy experience includes serving as Congressman Nick Smith's chief of staff and Michigan's deputy state treasurer for taxation and economic policy. And with that, I will turn it over to Paul Solman. Paul, it's all yours.
Thanks very much, David. Welcome to everybody. There is a chat function which you can put your questions in, and hopefully the technology will work so that I can read them, and I'll interpose them as we go. But let's start out by just doing the basic definitions of these so-called isms, or economic isms for the most part. And so Gary, if you'd kick us off. Capitalism was kind of a dirty word when it was first used, derogatory at any rate, but what is capitalism what's your definition of capitalism?
Well, my definition of capitalism is that it's not big government getting together with big business and doing things to make themselves better off. I mean, that's oftentimes how it's portrayed. It's really what Friedrich Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, and what he calls a social order. And basically, it's how we organize ourselves, both economically and politically. And one of the foremost things about it, it's based on private property rights. You own your property, you own your body, you own your car, and the government doesn't own it, as opposed to other forms of how we might organize ourselves, as we talk about communism or socialism, et cetera. So it's really based on the ownership of private property. And what Hayek points out is that private property creates a sphere of free action where you can act according to your own plan. You decide what you're going to buy. You decide how you're going to work. You decide what school you're going to go to. And private property rights creates this sphere of free action. The government, as you know, the government just can't break into your house, and the government can't just break into your car. It has to get permission to do that sort of thing. And it also is a system of limited government. That is, capitalism is not about anarchy. Ludwig von Mises pointed this out in an interesting little book that I recommend to everybody. It's called Liberalism, in the classical tradition that he wrote in 1927, where he predicted the Great Depression, he predicted World War II, he predicted the fascists would start World War II, he predicted that prohibition would fail, all based on how the political philosophy had moved away from a system of limited government to systems of government intervening in the economy and intervening in people's actions. So you need a government to protect the property rights. But that means that government also has to be limited. As Hayek points out, that what he calls information is decentralized. That means that it is clear that only I know how many hot dogs I'm going to want next week. There's no way that any of this, the central planner, Joe Biden, can't possibly know how many peanuts I'm going to want, or whether we should be putting oil into the production of gasoline or putting into production of home heating oil. Individuals know that. And because it's decentralized, the best way to make use of this information is we all get to act according to our own plan. That is, we get to decide and what we're going to buy and where we're going to work. And Hayek even points out that we may not know what is what we should be doing. But we have to have the ability to experiment. We have to go out and be able to try it. And I think most importantly, for people's perspectives, is that capitalism is a system of voluntary exchange. That is, I can't force you to buy my product. I can't force you to hire me. You can't force me to work for you. Everything that's done in a market system of what we call capitalism here, this system of capitalism, everything is done based on voluntary exchange. Just think about it. When you walk into the Walmart, they don't start putting all sorts of stuff into your cart and force you to pay for it as you go out. Nor do you get to throw stuff in your cart and you just say at the checkout counter, oh, I'm going to give you $10 for the whole thing, right? Mr. Walmart puts on, the package of donuts. Here's how much you have to pay me. And if you want to, then you can take it. And if you don't want to, then don't take it. In addition, that all the people that are standing at the checkout counter, I don't know about other places, but in Hillstead, we don't have vans that go around and grab people up and chain them to the checkout counters at the Walmart. If there's anybody that's standing there at the Walmart checkout counter must think that they're better off doing that than whatever else they could have done. Otherwise, there'd be somewhere else. They're being paid what economists call their opportunity cost. What's the value of their next best alternative? And what the system ends up with is what I always point out to my students, in fact, so often that they made a cut for me that says this, that 9 million people woke up in New York City today, and there was exactly the right amount of Starbucks coffee and exactly the right amount of peanuts and exactly the right amount of toilet paper. Let's just be amazed at that and ask ourselves, how in the world does this happen? And the way it happens is because of capitalism and prices.
And so this is
too many.
So this is the essence of it, is a free market system, a market of free or relatively free exchange between people who are not constrained by government to price things as they wish or buy things as they wish. Is that fair?
Yes. And if there's too much of something, the price will fall. And if there's too little of something, the price will rise.
Art, do you buy that definition?
In principle, yes. I think that's a fairly regular definition of capitalism, based on market system. Yes.
Yasha?
I buy it completely. I would only add that there's always a question about how much state regulation you have. And there's a broad variety of capitalist systems, some in which the state is very hands-off, and some in which the state does a lot to regulate the kind of market conditions under which these exchanges take place, whether you
So-
have minimum wages, what kind of regulations of different companies you have. No country has no regulation and no state interference, and no country regulates everything. And I think, once you regulate so many things that you essentially don't have free enterprise, you have very little free enterprise, we wouldn't call that a capitalist system anymore. But there's a wide range of countries where we would call capitalist, from somewhere like Singapore, perhaps towards one end, to something like Denmark or Sweden on the other end. And so I think it's important to point out that there's a variety of capitalist systems, and we can debate the respective merits, but I think they are all quite clearly capitalist.
Gary, do you accept that amendment to what you've said?
Well, I sort of do in that when we talk about regulation, I mean, so there's things that what economists call externalities, in that if you are a factory and you're making steam or something like that, and noxious hydrocarbons are going out into the atmosphere, or let's say sulfur dioxide is going out into the atmosphere, you're not counting that in your when you make your decision about how much to produce, and you're imposing costs on other people that are not being picked up in the price system.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, when things aren't being picked up in the price system, then you have an example where you need to have government regulation in order to make the system work more efficiently.
And so there would be therefore a range of ways, policies with respect to what people consider to be negative externalities or side effects of what you're doing. Fair?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So capitalism, we've now agreed on roughly what it is, and that there's a range. Art, socialism.
I think that in the US we tend to define socialism in contrast to capitalism, and you just heard a definition of capitalism that I think is pretty much to the point, and I think that Yasha's addition to that already shows a little bit of socialist ideologies creeping into capitalist societies and capitalist economic systems. Because of course socialism goes from the, if you go the Marxist tradition of socialism, from the failure of the capitalist system, of the capitalist economic system, and then specifically of the things that capitalism does not provide for. But in principle, I think it is a little too short-sighted to look at socialism just in contrast to capitalism. I think that we have to put it in a much more societal context, that socialism, especially in the way that it is being practiced in many parts of the world, the priority lies much more on societal issues, and that means that rather than focusing on the means of production as a public good rather than a private good as capitalism would define it, that I think that we should put more emphasis on the principles of community and equality, and especially equality of opportunity is a very big principle for socialism. Meaning that there are all kinds of obstacles in the way of individuals to have the same opportunity as everybody else. And so the role here of the government would be to take away some of those obstacles, or for the society to take away some of those obstacles. And that, of course, is only possible if we have a more communitarian sense, if we see the importance of us as human beings as part of, or us as individuals as part of a larger society, and the impact, the reciprocity of my actions versus the actions of other individuals in society. And so I think these are very important issues, and to create equal opportunity, the economic redistribution serves as a tool to create a better equal opportunity for individuals. And I think that that means that in different variants of socialism, we see possibilities of public and private ownership of means of production. It also means that for socialism, democracy is a very important point. And contrary to what many people think, the idea of individual freedom in the form of choice plays a role in socialism. Now, that choice is of course restricted in the by the choices, how choices affect the choices of other people. But that is not that different from capitalism, I would argue. And in the end, of course, the objection, because of course socialism is an ideal, is to create a form of self-realization. I want to keep it to that for the moment.
Is socialism, Gary said that capitalism is freedom to make choices. Government is out of the picture as much as possible, although there are negative externalities and so forth where government may have to intervene. Is socialism more nearly something that is an economic system that is negotiated through government, that government just plays a much larger role? Communism presumably is there's no state at all and everybody owns everything, but we're not doing communism tonight. Socialism is not socialism.
So first I object to it as a social system,
What?
as an economic system, sorry. Yeah,
but
I would object to that. I think it's a social system. And
socialism. You're
yeah,
talking about socialism now.
Yeah, socialism as a social system that has economic and political aspects. But to define it as an economic system, I think is rather problematic. And of course, that part of that has to do with the link to Marxism, which of course is very highly based on the economic analysis of Marx and Engels, of course. Now, your other question of participation, the idea in socialism is that everybody in the community would have participation in both the economic system and the societal system. Yes.
Okay, Gary, do you buy this definition?
I have a little bit of a problem with that, in that I believe the social order, an important point of the social order, is the economic system. And one of the things that happens in capitalism, where you get to act according to your own plan, but you get rewarded for the things that you do that turn out well, and you get disciplined for the things that you don't do well. It's going to result in an inequality of income. That has to happen. You can talk about equality of opportunity.
Wait, just a second. It has to happen because people have different ability, or some have more luck and others have less luck, or both?
That's exactly right. You can get
both.
Lucky. It's both. Yes, okay. Exactly.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think that in socialism, the idea is not so much that we all have the same income. The possibility is there for everybody to have the choice as to how much we want to work, what we want to work. And that then has different repercussions. Yeah, if I want to work more, I will earn more. If I work less, I will earn less. Yeah, this is it's not as much, the idea here is equal opportunity. How I work that out is a very different issue.
Let's, Yasha, come in here. Socialism,
well, look,
you think
right.
that's a fair definition of socialism that you've just heard?
I think the problem with the word socialism is that it can refer to very different things. That's not a critique of socialism itself, but it is a critique of the way that the word is often used here. So I think what Art has put forward is one kind of very mild reading of what socialism is. I would call it social democratic capitalism, broadly speaking. It clearly has a big market element. It would include things like a welfare state. It would include things like heavy investment in public education to make sure that people have relatively equal opportunities. That's present in most capitalist countries today. Now, you can call that socialism. The French left-wing party is called the Parti Socialiste, the Socialist Party. It clearly does not want to abolish capitalism. It has not abolished capitalism when it was in power, including until a few years ago. And on that reading, I think I could quibble with the details, but that's a broadly fair description of socialism. I think, however, it's important to point out that for much of the 20th century, and indeed for much of the 21st century so far, socialism has meant something very, very different. It has meant state control of means of production. It has meant people not being allowed to engage in free enterprise. It has meant incredibly strict regulation of a private economy, often with disastrous results, as we're seeing today in Venezuela. And so, when people tell you they're a socialist, I would encourage everybody to push them on what kind of socialism they're talking about. Are they talking about a capitalist system with a strong welfare state that I would call social democratic, but they can choose to call socialist? That's one kind of thing. Or are they talking about a system where you're not allowed to have free enterprise, where the state owns the overwhelming majority of all of the means of production, and that I think historically has had very, very bad results, including politically very oppressive results.
When you say means of production, that's a Marxist term. Could you explain for other people what means of production actually means in, April of 2021?
Sure. I mean, look, I run a magazine. The means of production in that context is not a factory or whatever you might imagine in the 19th century. It's simply, the account that I own, on the platform that allows me to email our articles to tens of thousands of subscribers. That can be the means of production in the 21st century. All it means is, are the private people who have a company with the kinds of resources and goods that the company has as part of it, or are they just state enterprises? Well, there might still be different enterprises, right? There's still sort of units of trying to produce different goods, and the electrical company is controlled by a slightly different set of managers than the toilet paper company. But ultimately, it is all owned by the state, and there isn't competition in a free market. There aren't private individuals who say, hey, I own this company, I can decide what it should do, but all appointed by the state in some kind of way.
Right. And so there's this distinction between private ownership, which is where Gary started, and more nearly collective ownership through the state or by some other means. Art, do you accept that what you're talking about is social democracy, that definition of socialism?
Yes and no. Meaning that
just say yes, and that would make it easier.
Yeah, it would be, but
I know.
The curse of the academic, isn't it? So I would argue that that Yasha simplified a little bit of what I said, meaning that he substituted community ownership with state ownership, and I think that is not necessarily correct. I think if we look at Northeastern Airlines, where the ownership of the company is with the employees, those are forms of socialist economy. I do agree that social democracy, and which is of course where I grew up in, and if I understand Yasha well, he did as well, that is a very mild form of socialism and is not comparable to state socialism as we see it in Venezuela, Cuba, or China.
Or North Korea.
Laos, or North Korea, although you can wonder about that even. So I think that's those are forms that the ideology takes on. That is different from the ideology itself, and so the ideology can take different forms. How it is being put into practice. Now, one of the big problems of socialism is, of course, how to design a society in which those ideals can be brought to work. And there we can, there's a lot to be said about that.
I'm guessing, Art, that there are people in the audience who are wondering who or what that is behind you. So I'm a slight digression as you explain the characters that you have choreographed yourself in front of.
Those are Calvin and Hobbes.
Calvin and Hobbes. That's John Calvin and Thomas Hobbes.
Exactly. Of course, kind of the realist versus the liberal discussion. More conservative versus the more experimental idea.
This is for those of you who don't know, this is a famous comic strip, or a relatively famous comic strip.
And for a political scientist, must read, I would argue.
Okay, so all right, so we've got capitalism we agree about. Socialism, there's wiggle room here with respect to how far you want to go and whether or not it's an economic system, I think, about which we disagree. My own position on this has been that socialism, simply, very simplistically defined, is how much is the state involved in the economy and how much isn't it? And in a place, some of these Scandinavian countries, let's leave Venezuela out of it, which is verging on a failed state anyway at this point. But for the very successful Scandinavian economies, 50, 60% of the economy is through the state. And in the United States, what is it, Gary? 30% less, something like that?
Probably. Actually, It sounds like what we're talking about is the index of economic freedom. I don't know if the audience is familiar with that, but the Heritage Foundation has one, and the Fraser Institute has one, where they rank countries from completely free capitalist to down to totally socialist, communist. So I think that's sort of what Art is bringing in, that there is a range of things that you would call socialism.
Yeah, and my own simplistic way of doing it is to say, okay, United States, Singapore is way off and on one tail of the distribution. If you think about how socialist or capitalist you are, that's very capitalist. And then you move over and you move towards Scandinavia at about 60%, and then on to countries which are greater than 60% and have a real problem and aren't doing as well as Scandinavia. Where the next question I was going to ask, and Gary, you've segued us into that. Where does the United States fit on this? If there is a spectrum, again, we're debating a little bit what socialism is, but if there's a spectrum on how much freedom, how much free market versus a market that is more nearly mediated by the state, where are we at the moment, Gary? And where are we with respect to where we've been historically? United States, that is.
Well, I think the United States is still one of the more capitalist countries, certainly in the top third or whatever. But it has certainly drifted in and out, actually. I think that when Reagan came in, he was called the great communicator because he was able to quickly point out some of the flaws with when government intervenes in the economy. But again, it's important that the government protect property rights. It's important that the government be involved in what we call negative externalities, or even what we call public goods. That is, if you look at national defense, okay, national defense is hard to be provided by a private company because if I build an anti-ballistic missile system, how can I exclude your house from it? And so if we said, oh, how much would you be willing to pay to have the anti-ballistic missile system? You'd probably say, I don't want to pay anything because you can't be excluded. So there are types of goods that only government is really capable of providing. So there, I think that in the last 30 years or so, we've been drifting more and more away from sort of the more free market capitalist system that I've been talking about, and more towards more towards art's idea of a system where the government intervenes in order to do certain things.
For those of you, there are students on this in this session. Ronald Reagan came in as the president in 1981, Republican president, with an agenda which was very different than the Democratic agenda. His agenda was much more towards what Gary has been talking about in the beginning. But Gary, I mean, in the 1930s through the 1940s, and arguably well beyond that and through the 1960s, wasn't there much more of what kind of Art is talking about, in the sense that America was moving towards more government involvement in the economy, more emphasis on freedom or access to opportunity and so forth? I mean, you think that in the last few decades, we've been moving back towards what people called at the time, what critics called at the time, a socialist economy in the United States, right?
Yes, it's very clear that when we had Franklin Roosevelt as president, I mean, there was definitely a movement, and that's why Mises wrote his book in 1927, actually, because he was observing fascism, which is central planning, going on in Italy and Germany, and he was seeing that we're developing socialism, more like Art was talking about in Great Britain, and populism in the United States. This definitely this movement towards more government and more central planning, and I think that then we drift back and forth actually over time, and I think that we're in the last while we were sort of on the trend towards more of the not necessarily towards a full-out socialist system, but more towards a Franklin Roosevelt sort of area.
I forgot, Yasha, I apologize. we did capitalism, we did socialism, but we didn't give you your stint, your platform for what is populism. So before we go back to an argument about where the United States is on this spectrum, we've got to get the third ism in. So Yasha, please, you're on.
Of course, great. By the way, I hope that we probably disagree about all kinds of things, and our disagreements are starting to come through, but we hopefully agree on the merits of Calvin and Hobbes. So if anybody in the audience does not yet know those
I've got books in the other room. I could bring them out. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Look, I think that we have talked about two ideologies that, whether or not they're exclusively about the economy, clearly have very clear prescriptions about how the economy should be run. In that sense, populism, I think, is the odd one out. It doesn't quite fit the other two ideologies that we've talked about. And if you've paid a little bit of attention to politics over the last years, you will have heard various people described as populists, especially on the international scene. So Donald Trump is often called a populist in the United States. So was Hugo Chavez, the now late president of Venezuela. So is Recep Erdogan, the president of Turkey. So is somebody like Viktor Orban, the prime minister of Hungary. And at first blush, that is a little bit puzzling, because these four figures don't necessarily have a lot in common. They certainly would not agree on which side of this economic debate we're on. Somebody like Donald Trump would say that he's a proud capitalist, in fact, that he wants, by and large, the state to play a smaller role in the economy. that he wants businesses to be more free to do what they want. Somebody like Hugo Chavez would call himself a socialist, would think that actually the state should have a much bigger role. And in fact, companies are by and large bad and dangerous and evil. So they don't agree in their views about the economic systems, nor do they necessarily agree on the different kinds of people they scapegoat. All of these populists tend to scapegoat certain groups, but they don't at all scapegoat the same groups. Somebody like Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, is very critical of Muslims and in many ways discriminates against them. Somebody like Recep Erdogan is very critical of people who are not Muslim within Turkey and discriminates against those. So again, they don't have a commonality there either. So you might ask, why group these people together at all? What is it that these different people have in common? Now, I think what they have in common is a kind of political style that ends up being very, very consequential. What they all say is that they and they alone truly represent the people, and that anybody who disagrees with them is by virtue of that fact bad or illegitimate. Evo Morales, the former president of Bolivia, who is now more or less in control of the country again, expresses populism better than anybody else in the 11 characters of his Twitter handle, which read Evo es pueblo. Evo is the people. And so what these populists tend to say is that the only real reason why there's real problems in the political system is that the elites are corrupt, that they're self-serving, that they're more interested in various outside groups than people who are quote unquote like you and me. And what we have to do is that for somebody who truly speaks for people to come in, throw the bums out, get rid of them, and finally do what people really want, finally represent the real people. Now, let me say a little bit about what that does to a political system and why I think that that's dangerous, no matter where on the ideological scale these politicians fall, whether they're on the left or the right, whether they scapegoat one group or another. And that's that our political system, I believe, is a liberal democracy. That's not liberal as in liberal and conservative. It's liberal in the sense that conservatives might talk about a democratic republic. It means that there's two core values that our political system cares about. The first is individual freedom.
That's the liberal that Gary was talking about. That's
yes.
How he used the term liberal early on. Yes.
Exactly. So that just means individual freedom, that you get to decide what to say or not say, who to have over for dinner or who to have stay over after dinner, whether you can criticize the government, what you can say about the government. And that requires basic rights, and it requires as well the rule of law, separation of powers. Because if a prime minister or the president has the right to throw you in jail if they don't like what you say, then you're not going to have your freedom of speech for very long, right? The second element is collective self-determination, that we are subject to laws. Every country has laws and we're subject to them, but that we collectively write those laws. There's some procedure by which we collectively get to decide our political fate, get to decide what kind of laws apply to us. There isn't an army general or a priest or an imam or a king who writes those laws for us. There's a democratic procedure by which we do that collectively. And populism, I believe, undermines each of those values. At first, it undermines the liberal value, the part that speaks to individual rights, because populists always blame various outsiders for their problems. And so they start to restrict the rights of those outsiders. And because they then go on to undermine the rule of law and the separation of powers. If you say, Evo es pueblo, I am the people. If you say, I am the real America, and anybody who disagrees with me is an enemy of the people or a traitor, then you're not going to accept that there is the separation of powers. You're not going to accept that sometimes the media can legitimately criticize you, that there's an opposition that can step in and stop what you're doing, that perhaps there's a Supreme Court that says, hey, that executive order is not in fact what you have a constitutional right to do, so we're going to overrule that. And so what you see in countries from Hungary to Venezuela, from Turkey to, I would argue at this point, the Philippines and perhaps Poland, perhaps India, is that these populist leaders, if they succeed, put their loyalists into all of these positions, undermine anybody who criticizes them, undermine independent media. And eventually they have full control of the courts, of the electoral commission, of the media. And that makes it impossible to remove a democratically elected leader by democratic means. And at that point, populism has not just turned about the first value, individual rights, it's also started to turn about against the second value, the democratic element itself, our ability to self-determine. Let me just say one thing very briefly at the end, which is that the way that I have described populism is, I believe, the sensible way to explain what these different figures have in common. It's really crucial for understanding contemporary politics. But if you read the New York Times or any other newspaper, Wall Street Journal for that matter, that's not always how people use populist. They often use, in the United States, populism in a second sense, which is simply a different concept. And that refers to a 19th century political movement, which was very critical of big companies and the sort of railway bosses and the way in which they believed certain rules to be rigged in the United States at the time, and wanted more agrarian power, more people power, anti-monopoly. And there are some politicians today, like Elizabeth Warren, for example, who are in some broad sense descendants of that ideological current. And so sometimes in the United States, people are called populists if they want higher taxes on corporations or they don't like monopolies. That's fine. That's a legitimate use of the term. It's different from what I've been describing. And I think the more important concept, the one that helps to understand the world better, is the kind of populism that I've described. You can choose to call one or either or both phenomena populist. It's up to you. There's no law that tells us which the right use of the term is, but be clear to distinguish between those two, because a lot of confusions arise when one person talks about the first kind of concept and the other person talks about the second kind of form of populism.
Gary, you buy that definition of populism?
Yeah, I did like that. I think that he's correct that that Elizabeth Warren definitely believes that she's got followers, and what we want to do is give Elizabeth Warren the power to go out and tax people who earn too much in some sense, her wealth tax. If you are highly successful in producing goods and services, then we're going to allow the government to come along and take some of your wealth away. And of course, that leads to economic consequences. If what happens is I'm not going to be rewarded for taking on the risk of innovating, then I'm not going to innovate as much. So this populism belief has clear economic effects, or let's say, I don't want to say clear because they're probably unintended consequences that people don't observe. I think what Gus talked about was observing, and I think that's something that what you're doing here is getting people to see and observe, and I appreciate that you're putting this on.
Art, do you buy Yasha's definition of populism and his concerns? I can't.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure.
I missed the first 2 minutes because my internet went out.
So
I'm not quite sure what he.
But Yasha basically said there were two kinds of. Some people conflate one kind of populism with another, or the phrase populism with another. That is the populism of the 19th century and against big corporations and so forth. But what he's talking about is this variety of populists throughout the world, from Modi in India and Orban in Hungary to Evo Morales.
I heard that part.
Oh, okay, very good. So
yeah,
sorry.
so that part I heard, and I very much agree with Yasha on that part. I think that he describes it very well. I think that he also describes the problem very well, the lack of democracy and the undermining of the political system. And that is almost an outcome of this form of populism if you start identifying yourself with the people. I do think that I understand the American tradition, but that is indeed a very different form of populism. And I do think that that we have to see Elizabeth Warren much more in the context of redistribution than in the context of populism. Having worked in Massachusetts and actually having talked to Elizabeth Warren on several occasions, I think she would not see it as much in the form of populism.
Mm-hmm. We were talking about, since I didn't give Yasha the chance to define populism before, but we were talking about where the United States stands. Gary had said the United States is more capitalist than in most places. I think you said the top third or something like that of the world. There are those who think that the United States is way more socialist than it ever was, and you were suggesting that it was going back in that direction, but we didn't include the populist dimension here. Gary, I'm going to go back to you here. How populist is America becoming, or how vulnerable is it to the kinds of concerns that Yasha talks about with respect to populism?
Well, I think that it is vulnerable. And again, I think it's because, like, the purpose of our program here is to get people to understand what we're talking about.
Right.
And like I said, one of the things that we need to focus on, I believe, is what I said, Mises talked about the unintended consequences of things happening.
By the way, just so people understand, there's a guy named Ludwig von Mises. He was a famous German conservative economist who talked about the value of the market system and the problems with deviating from it. Okay.
Yes, that's exactly right. And he was the one I was saying in 1927 wrote the book Liberalism and the Classical Tradition, where he talked about all these things happening. But one of the things that he pointed out was that once government intervenes in the system, it causes unintended consequences that people weren't thinking about. Then what happens is that people ask the government to fix the unintended consequences, which lead to more unintended consequences. So he argues that you end up with more and more government intervention and a movement away from the capitalist system, more towards a system of lots of central planning. And I think what we need to do is to realize, hey, this just as an aside, what if you took minimum wage, for example? If you did a minimum wage, well, yeah, that some people are going to get laid off, right? If I can't pay you $15 an hour if you can only produce $10 an hour worth of stuff, but not everybody's going to get laid off. And so if you want to have a minimum wage, I always argue that, okay, go ahead and have one if you believe that the benefits are greater than the cost, but you can't ignore the costs. So some people are going to lose their job. And to ignore that fact leads you to public policies that you wouldn't otherwise have. And I think populism has a tendency to ignore these or to overlook these unintended consequences of what the populist program would be.
All right, so populism ignores the central concept of economics, which is that you weigh costs against benefits. If the benefits are greater than the costs, you do it. If the costs are greater than the benefits, you don't, right? I mean,
yeah, I wouldn't say that it ignores it, but it certainly overlooks a number of the costs of these things.
Art, populism.
As far in the United States, I haven't even said how socialism versus capitalism, but which I have quite some comments on, because I think that we have to see that the Roosevelt New Deal was, of course, in relation also to the economic depression, et cetera, that we then, I think, at the moment, we are indeed, in my mind, also in a situation where the United States population is much more open to some socialist ideas. I also
By
think
socialist, again, to remind people, your definition of socialist is collectivist group ideas for the benefit of the community as a whole, right?
So can I ask? So can I ask a question about this?
Yeah, please.
There's some support for socialism in opinion polls in the United States. It's not actually that high, and if you ask people whether they prefer socialism to capitalism, it's far less than 1 in 5 people. But it seems to me that even that support basically comes from the fact that Republicans have started to call Obama a socialist and anybody a socialist. So when you say there's support for socialism in America, do you mean there's support for an expanded welfare state? Do you think there's support for universal health care?
I think so.
Or do you think that there's support for community ownership of companies so that you no longer have the S&P 500, but rather every company in the country is owned by its workers in some complicated way? Because that seems to me like it doesn't have much support in the United States.
No,
but that's your definition of socialism.
I agree very much with you that the American public is more open, and I'm not saying that there is massive support, but is more open to a welfare state idea than it was before. And I think part of that is because previously and not saying that this is not an issue anymore, but that the racial issue was so dominant and that it overrode to some extent the class differentiation. In current times, and if you see the very good book by Heather McGhee on The Sum of Us, you see that
what is that? Just you skipped over that too quickly. So
Heather McGhee, and the book is called The Sum of Us.
The sum, SUM of us.
Yeah, which is which basically makes the link between the black working class and the white working class and how they have common interest. Now, that is an outcome of what we see happening on a broader scale, I think, in American society, because that racial division, due to circumstances, is kind of diminishing. And so, not that it is gone, but there are different ways of looking at that. And part of that is with the younger generation. You also have to think about the fact that at the moment in the United States, we have a large population that was born after the Cold War. And so many of these younger people in the United States do not have the connotation with socialism that was constantly indoctrinated in American thought,
which that communism, socialism were kind of the same thing, and they were terrible, and that this was the end of the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thirdly, I think that the rising inequality between the high earners, the CEOs, and the common people, the workers. That includes academics. Has gone so far that many, again, of the younger generations have seen their parents, their grandparents, always been in that situation. And so the American dream, the idea that everybody can make it
and be better off than their parents,
has become an illusion to many of the younger generation.
Does it make them more vulnerable? But does it make them more vulnerable to? I don't want to use the word vulnerable with respect to socialism. Does it make them more receptive to socialism, or more receptive? Or to populism?
To both. I
think, yes?
Yes, I agree with that. On both counts, particularly when it comes to populism, I think it makes a huge difference that When you go from 1935 to 1960, the living standard of an average American doubled. From 1960 to 1985, the living standard of an average American doubled again. And since 1985, it's broadly been stagnant. And that makes a huge difference in how people think about politics, right? They used to say, you know what, I don't like these people in Washington, D.C. I don't trust them completely. They're far away and they're probably corrupt. But something seems to be working. They seem to be sticking to their end of the deal. Whereas now I think people say, hey, I'm not doing that much better than my parents were. My kids might do a lot worse than me. Why give them the benefit of a doubt? Let's try something new. And if some guy comes in and says, hey, I'm going to smash everything and I promise you I'll make everything better, what do we have to lose? But I want to scramble the terms of the debate here a little bit, if I may, Paul.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is that we're talking a little bit, and it is a natural way of talking about it. Do we want to go towards more capitalism or less capitalism? And if we go towards more capitalism, then we should have less of a welfare state. And if we go towards less capitalism, then we should have more of a welfare state. I actually think that's the wrong way of thinking about it. I want a lot more capitalism in the United States, and I also want a more generous welfare state in the United States. And I don't think that these two things are at odds with each other. So I'm worried, for example.
Yeah, explain how that.
I will do that. So I'm worried, for example, about the fact that the number of companies that Americans are founding has been going down or been stagnant, depending on how you look. I want Americans to be starting companies. I want them to be able to have ideas and go and found ambitious corporations that do interesting stuff, that improve the world and make a healthy profit. I think that's wonderful. I believe in that aspect of a market mechanism. I do think that there's a lot of useless and counterproductive regulation that really makes it hard for people to actually have economic activity. I think when you look at the very high housing prices that are pricing people out of opportunity in the major metropolitan centers of this country, it is far too hard for us to build things because of government regulations, far too hard for us to build new houses and new apartments and all of that. So in all of those respects, I want more capitalism. At the same time, I also think that it's a real problem for people in their 20s that, if they want to start a company of their own, they're not going to have health insurance. Even for people who are older, that if you take the risk of quitting your job in order to be creative, in order to start a new project of some form, that suddenly you're not able to go to the doctor. And so you stick with a job that you don't like. You do the boring things when actually perhaps your talents would be better used in much more adventurous ways. And when I look at a country like Sweden, which has many problems and is not the panacea, not the silver bullet that some people say it is, but that gets some things right, it has a more generous welfare state, including universal health insurance. And it also has a much higher rate of people in their 20s and 30s founding companies than the United States. And these two things, I think, are related because it's easier for people there to take those risks. And so I say, let's have more capitalism, but let's also have a more generous welfare state. And if you're doing that smartly, those two things can actually support each other.
Gary, how do you respond to that?
Unmute here. One of the things that I ask my students, I say, when you go out and get a job, are you going to ask if you're going to get benefits? And they'll say, yeah. And I'll say, would you ask them if they're going to pay for your car insurance? Are you going to ask them if they're going to pay for your fire insurance or your rental insurance? No, it's only health insurance. And then the question is, why is health insurance tied to your job? Again, going back to the unintended consequences, you can go back to wage and price controls in World War II. And then what happened was there was a excess demand for labor, but they couldn't raise the wages. And so they were able to get around it by having it tied to your job. And then there's a really good book by John Goodman called Priceless that talks about what our health insurance system would look like if it was allowed to be a market system. I mean, now it's really not a market system. And so I think Yash is exactly right that your ability to go out and start your own business, a lot of it's going to depend on, can you get a health insurance? So the question is, how much do we want to do? Say, we're going to tax everybody to provide health insurance for my kid. but maybe my kid doesn't, I'm wealthy enough to take care of my kid. And maybe we'd have to sort of think this whole thing through. Now, Milton Friedman, of course, talked about a negative income tax decades ago. He was a very free market guy. And the way the negative income tax worked was everybody got, so much per year. And as you earned income, the amount that you earned got, taxed away from the first amount that was given to you. So I'm not against provision of a Friedman type negative income tax, but we got to make it so that why are we giving all these benefits to everybody? Like a universal health care, why did we end up with a healthcare system that's based on your job? And B, why do I want to provide stuff for rich people as well as low income people?
Well, and we do have a negative income tax. We have an earned income tax credit, which Milton Friedman was
Yes.
the guy who conceptualized it and its policy. I mean, in this country. But Yasha, do you think that we shouldn't have employer connected healthcare? Is that a huge problem in this country?
Yeah, I agree that it makes a lot of sense to decouple whether you have health insurance to from what your current job is, precisely because it locks so many people into jobs where they're less happy than they might be, and they probably less productive than they might be. It's a huge impediment to the free allocation of labor to different job opportunities. Now, we can have different ideas about how to solve that. On one end, you say, let's have a completely free market and people just have to buy their health insurance. And if they don't have the money to have a health insurance, or perhaps they have a pre-existing condition, we're not going to be able to get health insurance. I'm opposed to that. On the other end of it, you have what's called a single payer healthcare system, like they have in Canada or the United Kingdom, where essentially we just run by the state a set of health institutions, hospitals and doctors' offices and so on. And broadly speaking, they're just funded from general taxation in the same way that, say, the army is run and financed.
Right.
I actually think that is a mistake as well. I've lived in the United Kingdom. I have friends in these countries. I think relative to the healthcare systems of many other countries I know, they're not very efficient. They have very long wait lists. But there are ways in many Scandinavian countries, in Germany and Singapore even, in which everybody does have health insurance. Perhaps it is tied to employers to some extent, in the sense that your employer has to make some contribution towards your health insurance. But if you're jobless, you nevertheless continue to be enrolled in those health insurances. So how much you have to pay in health insurance depends strongly on the level of your income. And that way you have some market elements, you have a competition between different hospitals, you have a competition between different health insurances, but you have truly universal coverage. So you can quit your job tomorrow and still have health insurance. So it's not going to stop you from taking that risk, from changing a job, from starting a company. That to me seems like a healthy solution.
Yeah, I just would say to the audience that as a TV reporter for, whatever it is, 35, 36, 7, whatever it is years, I've stopped counting. When you get to these kinds of issues, how do you construct a policy so that it's optimal with respect to everybody with regard to, in this case, health insurance? It's just, I don't want to do that story. And I don't want to have this discussion here because there are so many nuances and so many subtleties to how you actually construct such a policy. Art, that fair? I want to get you in here.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely fair, and I think that that Yasha's description is very fair as well. I think he's on the money. I totally agree with him to decouple as much as possible the healthcare system from employment. Of course, from a socialist idea, this is an idea of equality of opportunity. And so the obstacle of healthcare, taking that out of the way, would be a good thing. It's also a community idea, meaning that the idea of healthcare, the fact that I might not have healthcare. Of course, I'm state employee, so I have the West Virginia system, healthcare, which is much less than the Massachusetts one, I'll tell you that. But the point is that if I would not have it, and I would go to the emergency room, it makes the costs for those of you who do have healthcare much higher.
Yeah.
And so here is a reciprocity. It is in my interest that you have healthcare. And this is a part that is often under discussed, I think, in this whole healthcare debate, because the community sense and thereby also a selfish element is fairly important. Of course, I would think that Gary would come and say, okay, but if I'm a 20-year-old young man, the chance that I go to the emergency room is 0.01% or something. I'm just picking something out of the air. And whereas Gary, at his age, is much more likely to go. And so
Gary just had a hip replacement within a week, I think is right.
Yeah, March 15th. March 15th, I had total right hip replacement. Yeah.
The point here is, of course, that we share the cost. That at the point that I am able, that I'm not costing that much, and at that point, that some of my lesser cost then take care of Gary's cost, so that Gary doesn't have as much cost. That's the idea here of a universal healthcare system, and that's a community idea, and that is in my interest.
And that's why you define socialism the way you do.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I jumped the gun here before getting Yasha in on populism as to where the United States is and then where the world is. So Gary, you said the United States is moving back towards, and I have my prop here because I sometimes visit high school classes. Everybody know who this is? You guys know, but presumably this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he is, you can see there, I don't know if you can read it, but he is the man of the hour. This is a clock from 1933 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office, and I have it as, well, as you see, as a prop, but because the United States was in this depression, it was a depression that was at least perceived to be caused by overindulgence in the free market and the stock market and so forth. Whether that's right or wrong doesn't matter, and we won't debate it here. But the Democrat comes in after the Republicans had been in power throughout the 1920s into the early 1930s, and the Democrat says, no, we're going to do much more, nearly what Art is suggesting. We're going to share, we're going to, that's when Social Security was developed, that's when bank insurance was developed, on and on and on, all these public policies. And that's when America was, as Gary and I were talking about earlier, accused of being socialist, right? That we were going too much in the direction of what was then the boogeyman for America, which was the Soviet Union, right? Which had had a revolution in the late 1918, and it was communist, and oh my God, that would be the worst thing in the world. Didn't turn out all that well for Russia either. But in this country, that was, Roosevelt's critics claimed that he was socialist or communist, and that's where, but he prevailed, right? Because he came up with policies which Art would be promoting here today, and I think Yasha, you'd be sympathetic to as well, which are more nearly in the interests of the community as a whole, right? That fair, Art?
I think that's very fair. I also want to say what you just said, of course, brings up and make the link to where are we in the world.
Yes.
If we look at specifically the European experience with social democracy, where the declining population, the demographics are becoming a problem, and where immigration is becoming a problem in that sense, meaning that the declining population means a lesser base to pay for the system, the social security system that was that had been put into place, and so solutions had to be found, and that meant oftentimes to less socialist policies.
Right. Just to explain what Art's talking about is, if you have the baby boom, as I'm about a year and a half ahead of the traditional definition because I'm 76, but the people who are working are getting to the point, the baby boom, that is lots and lots of kids, lots of who are now older people are retiring, and fewer people coming along. And if the whole point of Social Security was something called pay as you go, which is that one generation pays for the next, then you've got a real problem if you have fewer workers paying for more retirees, right? That's what you're talking about.
That's absolutely what I'm talking about. It's also, and then the other aspect of that, of course, is immigration, which means of more people, initially at least, who need to make use of the social system. And so that brings then an extra burden to the system as well. Now, which is different in Europe, I want to say, than it is in the United States.
Yeah, we don't have that. That's not the issue here so much.
No, not at all.
One argument, just so people know, one argument for rescuing Social Security is to have more immigrants in the United States, because the people who come to this country are already working age for the most part, and it's not old people or babies who are coming, it's people who are working age, and they would then pay into the system, and that would be a way of righting the balance, right?
Well, and yes, that's absolutely true. And actually, in a previous profession, I did research into this, and actually, yeah, the cost of immigration in the United States is actually negative.
Yeah, that means that
is a positive thing.
It's a positive thing, right?
Yeah, yeah. And you know, as I hope I am too.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
As an immigrant,
you are an immigrant who's paying for my Social Security. That's right.
Exactly. And so I think that in Europe also the social system is a little bit more different, and because of the equality of opportunity, that means also that the social system has a higher bar, and therefore it is much more likely that immigrants need to use, and I'm talking Western Europe here, okay, and what you guys were discussing previously as Scandinavia, but I would argue that includes Germany, and that includes the Netherlands, that includes Belgium, etc.
So Gary thinks we're moving more towards my friend Franklin Roosevelt here. I don't mean he's my personal friend, obviously. He's we have no personal relationship, but my friend in terms of a prop. You think where are we? Where's the United States at the moment?
I don't think so. I think that the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt socialism, is very different of what we are doing now. I do agree. I think that the mindset is much more open towards socialist policies. But I think that Keynesian policies, and here Keynes, of course, is the economist who was a reaction to the Marxist critique on.
Here we go. I've got him here too. That's John Maynard Keynes, the most famous, presumably, well, with Hayek, his ideological opponent, who Gary's talked about. This is John Maynard Keynes, the 19th century, the 20th century's other most famous economist. Yes.
Yeah, so I think that Keynesian policies have taken a lot of the angle out of capitalism. Yeah, the negative angle out of capitalism, and therefore the direction that we're taking of equality and opportunity is a very different one than it was in the 1940s. But there is that direction. I would argue that the rescue plan, or the American Care Act, as well as the proposed American Jobs Act, have elements of equality of opportunity in them, and that we would not have seen under under Reagan.
Okay, Yasha, where are we?
Yeah, so let me say something about the United States and something about the world. Look, I think in the United States, to an extent that it's hard to appreciate if you're relatively young and you haven't studied a lot of economic history, we've really swung back and forth between extremes over the last 100 or so years. It's easy to think that the economic system of America has always been roughly the same, but actually it really has varied quite strongly. So when you are in the 1910s and the 1920s, you're pretty far towards laissez-faire capitalism, pretty far towards not having much of a welfare state, and so on and so forth. Then, as people have been saying, Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes in, and part influenced by the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, so you can put both of them into the camera at the same time.
There you go.
And you get actually a very long consensus of reasonably high taxation and a somewhat more generous welfare state. When Ronald Reagan comes in 1981, he comes in at a moment when there's a 70% top marginal federal tax rate, which is to say that above a certain level, 7 out of $10 you make are taken out of you by tax. Today, the top marginal tax rate is 37%, so close to half of what it was in 1981. So what we've seen for the last 3 or 4 decades is something that's much more capitalist than the period from the early 30s until, let's say, right around 1980. And now it seems as for the incipient signs that what some people are calling the neoliberal era, I don't much like the term because I never know what people mean by it, but those decades of relatively low taxation, relatively sparse welfare states may be coming to an end. That's in part because of the great.
For what people mean by neoliberal is liberal in the sense that Gary used the term way back, which is freedom, the marketplace, private property, and so forth. And neoliberal is the regeneration or the regeneration of that kind of ideology, right? Is that fair, Yasha?
We've defined so many things. Let's let the definition of neoliberal drop. I don't think it has a very coherent definition. I think people just tend to use it, especially in academic discourse, to say, I don't like it. If your professor says that's neoliberal, that's basically to translate to boo, except he wants to sound fancier. That's my personal take. But undoubtedly for the last 30, 40 years, there has been a more pro-market and anti-welfare state consensus. And now I think there's various reasons to think that may be coming to an end. That the Democratic Party, at least for the moment, is more robustly left-wing on economic policy, is a little bit more critical of capitalism in certain ways. It has greater components of people who explicitly argue for socialism. But very interestingly, also the composition of the Republican Party is changing. The Republican Party, which traditionally has been the party of people who are more well-off, of sort of people who are members of country clubs, if you want to sort of make it simplify a little bit, suddenly have realized that actually a lot of the voters are working class, that a lot of them are poorer. And they are starting to play with the idea of actually being in favor of a more generous welfare state as well. And so I think we may be in one of those moments when the consensus shifts and we're going to start seeing a movement towards more regulations on big business and a larger welfare state. But let me say something else, because
I just wait 1 second. Gary, do you agree with that?
Well, I do agree that we're definitely moving towards
what you were saying before, right?
And I'm not as concerned about the redistribution as the government intervention, but to the extent that the redistribution causes people's behavior to change, that's the problem. Like if I know I'm going to get an extra $600 a week in unemployment benefits, then I'm less likely to go back to work.
Very good. Yasha, continue, please. I'm sorry.
So that's the story in the United States. I think the story around the world is actually significantly different. Look, until 1989, we have had systems that called themselves socialist, whether you think they were socialist or not, they called themselves socialist, that did allow the state to own all of the companies, all of what might be called the means of production. So there really was very, very limited or no free enterprise in large segments of the world until the 1980s and the early 1990s, in China, in the Soviet Union, in parts of Germany, in Cuba, and so on and so forth. And that system survived in a couple of small places, in Cuba and North Korea, but really in very, very few parts of the world. In Russia, you now have private enterprise. In China, you obviously now have a lot of private enterprise. So capitalism really triumphed over those 30 or 40 years. And in that sense, the world is much more capitalist than it was 40 years ago. And one of the things that happened is a huge increase in global and international trade. Now, a year ago, because of the coronavirus pandemic, there was an idea that this is coming to an end, that the open global markets are going to be a matter of the past, because people argued the pandemic was showing them to be irrational. It was showing that these just-in-time production processes where, you know, parts of certain cars cross the border between the United States and Mexico back and forth 40 times in order to have each process take place where it's the most efficient. You know, needing parts from 17 different countries. Suddenly all of that, because of a pandemic, people thought was not going to work. And so you're going to have a lot more homegrown production, much less international trade, and in certain ways, less capitalism as a result. The New York Times wrote an article a year ago saying the coronavirus pandemic is the end of the world economy as we know it. And a lot of people were saying, hey, this is going to be the hour of government and the failure of a market economy. Look at the lines for toilet paper in your local supermarket. The government is going to come in and rescue us. The economy is not going to work. Well, I wrote an article at the time saying that I did not believe any of that. And I think that I've been vindicated over the last year. Yes, there was shortages of toilet paper for a couple of weeks because everybody went crazy and bought toilet paper for a year. But within 2 or 3 weeks, you could buy toilet paper at your local supermarket. Again, I think the private economy, supported by the welfare state and supported by the kinds of payments we did need to small companies and to individuals for them to be able to pay their rent. So welfare state capitalism has done extremely well over the last year. I got my vaccine recently. It is because of some government investment, but also a lot of private initiative that we have this miraculous way of being able to go back to normal life. Governments in many places failed, and that's a different topic, but you know, in most countries around the world, democracies and dictatorships, governments did far worse than we imagined, were not able to contain the pandemic, had irrational policies. I think there's a lot to criticize there. Global trade, as of the past month, is back up to the levels it was at a year ago. So I think when you think about it globally, the story of the last 3 or 4 decades is that capitalism has spread to parts of the world where it was only present in a very limited way until recently. And the story of the pandemic is that the event that was meant to show the irrationality of capitalism and globalization and set it back, that was meant to mean the end of a world economy as we know it, actually turned out to prove its resilience.
So we have 2 completely different takes on this. Gary thinks we're getting closer and closer to my prop here, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or for that matter, John Maynard Keynes. And Yasha thinks quite the opposite. Art, are we moving more towards capitalism, more towards social democracy? Where are we going?
Well, so worldwide, I think that Yasha is absolutely correct. I think that the increased trade has created open markets, and that actually goes back towards the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, with the liberalization of Latin America, coming out of the debt crisis, et cetera, et cetera. But also what we see, the failure of the Soviet Union has led to the free market to become dominant. And
are we better off as a result? That's the question.
Well, the question is, how do you define better off?
Well, I don't know. How do you define better off? However you
Well,
define.
that's a question of priorities.
Well, what's your priority?
Well,
Are
as
we
an
better off?
look, I'm an academic. I'm teaching
you're
at
a
a public
person.
school. I'm getting paid peanuts. So for me, economics is not the important part. Yeah. So priority-wise, for me, is social issues rather than
Well,
economics.
are we
As long as
better
I can
off?
live.
Whatever your metric is, are we better off as a result of the trend?
No, I think not. Social, based on social and equal equality, no, we're absolutely not better off worldwide. Economically, in big sense of trade, yeah, of course, but the distribution is the problem.
Gary, are we better off or worse off? Are we getting better off or worse off?
Well, we're definitely getting better off in terms, I tell my students, look, you're wealthier than the wealthiest man in the world 100 years ago. Like John D. Rockefeller did not have antibiotics. He didn't have color television, and you're going to have inequality is going to get larger if we expand trade. That is, I always say, look, Bill Gates or Steve Jobs could sell his product to 1.3 billion Chinese that you couldn't in 1970, and to a billion, 1.2 billion Indians that you couldn't years ago. So you would expect that inequality is going to get larger. The real question is, how wealthy are the poor? I mean, I don't care about inequality. I care about how wealthy are the poor. And I think the capitalist system has made the poor much more wealthy than they were.
But Gary, you think that we're going back towards, I'm not going to use my props again, but you think we're moving back in the wrong direction. So are we worse off for the fact that we're moving in the wrong direction?
I think we're certainly going to be worse off in that we are moving in the wrong direction. I think that we'd be better off if what we did was we focused on allowing people to act according to their own plan. And, Yas is right. We need to improve the equality of opportunity. But how does that come about? By having an education system that's not government driven.
Yasha, are we better off or worse off? David's going to come in here now as we're ending the session. But
I'm going to make 4 points and I'm going to make them very quickly.
Please do.
We're better off economically, politically, socially, and I have a mystery category. Economically, it is undoubtedly true that the world is much, much better off. The average American is a little bit better off. There's a lot to worry about there. The average resident of the world is vastly better off. We have lifted 2 billion people out of poverty just in the last couple of decades. These are people who did not have access to running water, not have access to electricity, not have access to stable food supplies a few decades ago, who now lead modest but much, much more humane lives. It is one of the great triumphs of human history. We're much better off politically because many of those countries, you can call them communist, they call themselves socialist, were terribly oppressive, terrible dictatorships, which regulated every aspect of the people's lives and did not allow them to criticize the governments or the living conditions in any serious way. And so the story of democracy has been fitful over the last decades with some real advances and a lot of backsliding over the last 15 years. The world is much freer than it was 30 years ago. I think the world is socially much better. There's a lot to criticize. We did not talk so much about cultural issues and race and so on today. There's a lot to criticize about the current state of the world, but the United States is much more tolerant than it was 40 years ago. Western Europe is much more tolerant than it was 40 years ago, and most parts of the world are much more tolerant than we were 40 years ago. And now we come to the surprise category, because just at the very end, when Art can't respond to me, I'm going to disagree with him very strongly. The world is more equal than it was 40 years ago by a lot. Now, when you look within countries, many of them have grown more unequal. But because countries like the United States have grown, but grown relatively slowly, and because countries like India and China, and by the way, Nigeria and Kenya have been growing very, very fast for the last years, the world as a whole is much, much more equal than it was 40 years ago. So there's much to fight about, much to be upset about with the state of the world. There's also much to celebrate, and we shouldn't forget that either.
Okay, David.
I would argue that that's problematic, though, that to compare countries rather than people. Yeah, I think that I agree absolutely that countries are more equal.
No,
Absolutely.
if you take all of the individuals around the world, they are more equal. It's not just that the average in Kenya has gone up because all the rich people in Kenya have gotten richer. It is that if you take every resident of the world has become more equal because so many people have been lifted out of poverty. So many people now have much more worthwhile lives than we did 20 years ago.
But that does not mean that it is more equal.
But
Well, it does. If you do a Gini coefficient and run it on all the individuals in the world, it is better now, or it shows more equality now than it did 40 years ago.
Gini coefficient, just for people, is Gini efficient of one would be that everybody had it's the same amount, same percentage of the total wealth as everybody else. And then when you deviate from that's what he's talking about. But we needn't go into the technicalities of that. Do you guys think that that's true after the pandemic too? There's been lots of talk. There's been lots of writing about how the pandemic has set the poorer world back, right, Yasha?
Well, I think probably the world will be more unequal on the 31st of December this year than it was on the 31st of December a year or two ago, but it's much more equal than it was 10 or 20 years ago.
Okay, great. David.
Well, first of all, I want to say thanks to all of you. So I'm going to go one by one. Paul, we have had, this is our 10th American Conversation series, and we have not had a finer moderator of any event than you. And if we were, as we would hope that we could be, on stage with a live audience, you would have a standing ovation tonight, my friend. Thank you. You were just everything you were billed to be, and I'm so appreciative.
Thank you.
To Gary and Yasha and Art, the three of you were unbelievable, and I could not be, and I'm sure I speak for our community, our Shepherd University community and our Stubblefield Institute community, that the three of you were magnificent. And I'm going to take full credit for the three of you because I selected you, and you guys were it was just great. And I believe personally, I just want to say to those who were a part of our audience tonight, this is what the Stubblefield Institute is really trying to do: bring divergent viewpoints together, have intelligent conversations so that we can learn. And because when we learn, what we do is we go out into our communities and we then can have intelligent conversations with our neighbors and our friends, because what we're trying to do, and I don't want to forget our students. We had students on this audience tonight. These are juniors and seniors in college who are interested in civic engagement and political discourse and politics, and you have contributed to their education, and I think that's really important.
Can I get in my pitch for the American?
I wanted to bring that up because one of the things I promised Paul is that he has a pet project, the American Exchange Project, which I've now researched, and I'm pretty excited about this as well. So please, Paul, take it away.
So for all of you, the Gary, Yasha, Art, and everybody out there, it's a nonprofit. It's called the American Exchange Project. You can go online, look it up. It's AmericanExchangeProject.org. And it's an effort to get kids from all high school seniors from all over the country to visit each other from across the various divides: rural, urban, north, south, left, right. And first online, they get to be friends. This will start in earnest. It's been frozen by the pandemic because it's all about ultimately visiting each other's communities. And so it will start in the fall. High school seniors will begin to connect with each other. We've been doing it for a few years as a pilot project, but they'll be beginning to connect with each other in March of 2022. And then we'll go and visit each other's communities and be involved in each other's communities for 10 days to 2 weeks in the summer of 2022.
And the website for that, to learn more about that, would be
AmericanExchangeProject.org, just the American Exchange Project. And the plea to all of you, Gary, Yasha, Art, David, and everyone out there, is to connect us with people in communities across the country, whether it's in Shepherdstown or anywhere else, so that we can extend our reach. These are free trips. We've raised some money and we'll raise some more to be able to subsidize free trips.
It's so awesome.
So the kids can meet each other from, Palo Alto to Lake Charles, Louisiana, where we are, Longview, Texas to Lexington, Massachusetts. We're in those communities as well. And we're just trying to reach out to everybody. Thank you, David, for letting
It's just so awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. And to all of you who have tuned in tonight, we do have a vehicle in which you can contribute or support our institute. You can go online at stubblefieldinstitute.org and become a friend of the Stubblefield Institute. I hope that you got something out of tonight. I know that I certainly did. Thank you all to the moderator, Paul Solman, and to the panelists, Gary Wolfram and Yashka Monk and Art Holstack. Thank you so much. It was a great evening, and I am so incredibly grateful personally for your time and for your contribution. Peace, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.